We are now live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. And today I'm very excited because we have guest Premee Mohamed is here today to talk to us about Beneath the Rising and all of her favorite topics, which we are not sure what they are, but we will find out. So I'm very happy to have you here, Premee.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
So yeah, okay. So I really hardly know where to start with this book, but I mean, there's a lot of awesome there. And maybe what I'll do is I'll start with my sort of favorite starting point, which is to say, where was the place that this story first started blossoming for you?
That is a super interesting question. And I'm not sure I've been asked it before. When I was actually writing it was in my first undergrad. So about 2000 to about 2002. So I finished it the year I graduated. And I think where it came from was the science that I was doing, actually, and what I saw as unreasonable or inexplicable limitations to what we were doing. You know, like, okay, we're undergrads. Yes, of course, we don't have any money. They're not going to give the good expensive stuff or the good reagents or the really difficult experiments, or, you know, let 16 and 17-year-olds play on the really fancy microscopes and stuff. But some of the limitations, I was like, well, what would you do if you didn't have any of those? What would science look like? And what would the person who wasn't limited look like? And what kind of absolutely god-awful, terrible personality would they develop? And that is how the character of Johnny Chambers came about, basically, was someone who's basically never been said no to in her entire life. And I like describing the book the way somebody I bumped into at Worldcon, and I wish I had gotten his name, because he sums it up so well. He said, it's about a scientist who solves the world's energy problem and creates a bunch more problems. I was like, thank you, that's a really good log line. Because when people were asking me what it was about, I was just waving my hands and going, oh, you know, elder gods and magic and really bad stuff and sand.
Yeah. So when you were starting with the science, did you have an idea of what form you wanted the problems to take already?
Not really, no. I had written a bunch of really bad novels by that point.
Many of us have.
Just super bad, and that were just kind of like a string of anecdotes, things just happening and not connecting to each other. You know how those things go. And then you end up with like a 400,000 word epic with like elves and dwarves and volcanoes, and you realize you've lost like 15 characters because they were in the start of the book and you forgot they existed, and there's plot holes everywhere, and people have found secret keys and then they don't use them, and, you know, stuff like that. So this one I wanted to be a little bit more intentional and certainly shorter, and that meant coming up with something that would really challenge this idea of someone who kind of had no limits. You know, what happens when she runs up hard against one that she didn't expect and kind of can't fully or think or buy her way out of?
Yeah. Interesting.
Juliet takes lots of notes, so don't worry.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So in the meantime, I'll jump
I was
in with
having
the
about
question.
10% of a panic attack there. So
No.
Sorry. So,
no worries.
Yeah, you know,
Take lots of notes.
I
and
really ought to explain, but I've done it so many times, I keep forgetting. Sorry, Premee.
No worries.
I'm fascinated by what you're saying, and I'm writing it down to the best of my ability
Oh,
so
okay.
that I can write up Well, so I'm super behind on this, but what I like to do is I like to write up what people have said for my blog later, so that people
Okay.
don't have an hour to listen to the video, can have the benefit of skimming through and seeing what you said and all that. So it's not you, it's
Okay.
totally me trying to keep up with wanting to know, wanting to be able to pass on what you have said to I don't know, people who might not be able to, hear the video or stuff like that. So
Awesome. Thank you.
yes. Okay. So let me ask you about the elder gods angle. How did you land on that in particular?
It's funny because when I first started kind of coming up with the idea that maybe this was the next book I wanted to work on, I had just come out of 12 years of Catholic school. So the elder gods were actually not going to be elder gods in the first draft. In the first, I don't know, 3/4 of it, they were actually standard bog-style Catholic demons, regular demons, if that's a thing. But around that time, I actually started getting into reading more older fantasy and sci-fi and horror. And yeah, it wasn't until I was, I don't know, 18, 20, something like that, that I first read any Lovecraft or Howard or anything like that. I had read some Poe, but I started getting into it. And then I thought, oh, these guys would be such good bad guys. They're so bad. They're so incomprehensibly bad, actually, that you can make them into anything you want.
Yeah.
And the Pope won't come after you, which is good.
That's true. Advantages.
Yeah, exactly. So it as I got into it and started making the decision to change the bad guys, I got more into kind of the mythos, and then started to read other stuff later on. Like when I was polishing the book up for querying, which wasn't till 2016, there was a lot more kind of modern mythos, modern cosmic horror out for me to look at and be like, okay, I didn't make the worst decision ever. So, and yeah, it's a sandbox, I think, or it felt like a sandbox that because some of its creators were just such god-awful people, you could just take whatever you wanted and play with it and sort of take it back from them and put it into a story that honestly they probably wouldn't have liked, because oh god, there's women, there's brown people, there's women and brown people. I can't cope. So
yeah,
I assume that would have been Lovecraft's reaction.
Very likely. And I was actually wondering whether that was one of your goals in including that.
Not really.
Develop later.
it did develop. It kind of I wasn't trying to like slap in the face type thing. It did develop later, so I assume it must have been unconscious to put in the things. Well, and also I didn't know anything about him personally as a person or an author, just that he had written all these short stories and bits and bobs and of things in poetry. I didn't know about his life or his prejudices, which were many.
Yeah.
Like I didn't even know what he looked like until like 5 or 6 years ago, probably.
Well, I mean, yeah. So, but I mean, it's still. I see what you're saying about having a protagonist who's never ever run into any kind of meaningful resistance, run slam into something that's utterly without a possibility for traction. Like, I mean, I think honestly that the Lovecraft angle is definitely one of the, it lends itself well to that, because it's really one of those things where it's like, and there's nothing at all that you can do.
I liked that. Like when I started reading the stories, I think I started with the more kind of common ones, right? That are all well, I saw a thing and I went mad and it was terrible. Or my friend saw a thing and he went mad. Or I heard that there's a cult down in the swamp and they all went mad. And also, I am on a submarine and am also going mad. Like, it seemed that he had deliberately set up stories where the resolution every time was humanity cannot cope with the villain. So you just have to imagine what happens next now that we know the villain is in the world. And I thought that was just, I mean, there's a couple of stories where people attempt to fight back or, you know, stuff the alien back into the cube or rebury the artifact. Or I think of the Dunwich Horror, which with those, was it 3 men, 2 or 3 men who make that powder that they find in an old book, and then they go up to the top of the hill with the standing stones and they go like this with their sprayer, with their insect sprayer, and they spray the powder so they can see the Shoggoth. And that's kind of the best you can do. Because otherwise you have encountered a villain who not only can you not fight, but you can't even understand. And if you look at it, yeah, you may go mad. So to me, that seemed to lend a lot of flexibility to virtually anything that you wanted to do with them.
Yeah. So
have you ever played Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing game?
No, I haven't actually.
It encodes that into the game. Characters have a sanity stat that starts at some number less than 99 and goes down slowly during the course of the campaign. And when you get to sanity of 0, your character is permanently mad and becomes an NPC.
It's supposed to go down slowly, Cliff?
Well, it could go down slowly or quickly, depending on the scenario.
Depending on your GM.
Or your character's stupidity.
Yeah, the characters usually either die or go insane. Those are the 2 most common things that happen to player characters in Call of Cthulhu. It incorporates that into the rules. It's a core rule.
Yeah. No, that's a good rule. I think Lovecraft himself would have been like, yeah, that's legit. Those are the only 2 outcomes you can have.
Yeah.
Pretty much. I mean, even Randolph Carter, you know, winds up a weird alien space monster.
Yes, he does. Tragic.
You know, right? He was one of the most flexible mentally of all of them.
He was like the only interesting character.
Sure.
So let's get back to the book.
Right, the book.
I mean, well, we could go down that route. I still have questions about the book. So like when you're dealing with these, so you're dealing with a sort of unstoppable force, immovable object. There's a certain degree of just sort of human consequence, right? Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to explore human consequences in this book?
Yeah, I guess if I take your meaning correctly, it's kind of not just the consequences for the characters, but the consequences kind of for all of humanity. Or
and in interpersonal relationships. I mean, because like I don't know, one of the things that I find interesting is when you set up a bunch of principles, right, and then you put people in them and you watch what happens to the people.
Oh, okay, yeah, it's yeah, that was tricky actually, because you do actually have real human beings, and not just real human beings, but quite young human beings that are not only tasked with dealing with this threat for various reasons that become clearer in the book. I don't even know who's read the book or not. I'm trying to avoid spoilers, but this is like not easy.
Well, you can actually spoil if you would like. This is a potentially spoilery show. It's totally up to the author. Just sort of like wave your hands and go spoilery if you want.
Okay, I'll wave my hands. But the friendship in a lot of books that I read is expected to save the day. It's because you are not alone, and because you recognize also that you've got skills and resources and choices and strengths to bring to the friendship, that the book eventually ends happily, right? So you get to the end and you close it and you generally go, that's awesome. It's because they were friends that they managed to save the day. And in this case, it starts out that way, but there's too much going on in the friendship for that to actually be the way it ends. And yeah, don't ask me about the sequel.
I was going to, but you really are serious.
I can do some hand waving about the sequel. But what basically it ends up with is the friendship is, for obvious reasons, shattered. And that's the cost, more or less, of solving the problem of the book. If you look at a book as a question to be asked or a problem to be solved, in this one, it's how do we prevent these ancient enemies from returning to a place that we thought they couldn't return to and destroying the world?
Right.
And the answer is, well, a smaller human story has to have a sad ending.
Yeah.
And the larger story kind of has a happy ending. And
Yeah.
I became more interested in that kind of as I was going along, is how much worse could I make it, not just for the two characters and not just for the world and not just for the people around them, but for the friendship. And if they even thought near the end that friendship would save the day, what would they give up to make sure that they were still together at the end of it? And the answer turns out to be a lot.
Yeah.
It's kind of like working with someone you hate. You still want to get the project done.
Yeah, right.
But then you never want to see them again.
Oh boy.
That was not throwing shade at my job specifically, but
well, cool. Okay, so I know you're probably going to hate me for this, but I do want to ask about the sequel.
let me tell you about the sequel.
Yes, please.
So, as I said, I just blogged about second book syndrome. So my trials and tribulations with writing the second book are already out there in public. So if my editor reads this, I'm sorry, it's the worst book I've ever written. We'll fix it. But mainly there were so many choices and so many places to go after the end of the first book.
Yeah.
And again, the main problem was writing a sequel something like 18 years after you had finished writing the first book.
Oh yeah, that's true.
When I wrote the first book, when I started, actually, I was I saw them as peers. I was about Nick's age. I was 18. And so the way they talked and the stupid decisions they made and the jokes they were making and stuff and the movies they were quoting they all felt very contemporary to me. Like, it's set in 2002. It was finished in 2002 initially. And now it's 2020, and I am a decrepit old hag who yells at Generation Z to get off my lawn, and I will hit them with a cane. But those 18 years make a difference. And I was like, how could I possibly recapture that voice? But not only that, the feeling of being 18 and having demands on you that you didn't have as a kid, but not having demands on you that would be the same as if you were an adult, and trying to find your place in a world that, at least for Nick, doesn't seem to need him, doesn't seem to think he's useful. And moving on with the arrogant superstar best friend who frankly has learned nothing from this.
Yeah.
You know, where do you go from there in terms of a narrative? And what can you throw at them when you've already thrown the worst things there are at them? So those were the questions that I kind of went into the sequel with, which is why I scrapped and rewrote it about 8 times and had to ask for an extension on it, because I was asking questions I did not have the answer to and did not feel comfortable answering, even for my own characters, which as a novelist is just freaking terrible.
Well, I mean, it's hard. It's very hard.
I turned it in though on time. I was an hour and a half before deadline.
Woo! Congratulations.
That totally counts.
It counts. It counts.
So the new one is set in 2020?
No, it's not.
Okay.
Is it
New one-
like chronologically? Is it immediately after book one?
It's, let me think. It's about 18, 19 months after book one.
Mm.
And
So that-
the reasoning behind that was, and I talked about this in the blog post as well, and this is going to sound really terrible, but the thought that, particularly for youngsters, time heals all wounds. I did not want those wounds to heal. And I
Mm.
wanted everything to still be raw and nasty, and for forgiveness and self-critique and self-reflection to not have really been a thing yet.
Okay.
All right.
Well, that's, that's what you're dealing with. So absolutely.
Yeah, it's my editor's problem now, not my problem.
Well done.
I handed it in, now it's his problem. But it's going to need a lot of work because, again, trying to write from the perspective of a 19, 20-year-old as an old lady, no, it was very, very difficult.
You know what? I was actually fascinated by the voice that you used in the book.
Mhm.
And I was wondering how much of that was just sort of instinctive and how much of it was planned.
Well, it was about 85% of the book that got published was what was written in 2002. About 15% was the polishing up that I did before I queried, and my agent did before we submitted it, and my editor did when we were getting it ready for publication. So it's about 85% contemporary to someone who was about Nick's age. So that's where that voice came from.
Cool. Nice.
Which is why I am worried about the voice in the sequel.
I get you. Very cool. Very cool. So let's see. I have a question. Were you involved in the choice of your cover?
No. Actually, I did not know that that was my cover until someone actually pinged me on Twitter to let me know that it was up for pre-order on Amazon. So that was the first, that was actually the first that I knew of what the cover would look like and also how much it was cost, which was very exciting. And I almost pre-ordered it. And then I was like, wait, no, do not do that. You have already read this book.
Plus, they're going to give you one, right?
They gave me 42 copies. Yeah.
Nice. That's a good number.
Yeah, it's a good number. They're all hanging out in my spare room because they kind of took over my house when they arrived.
Right.
Wow.
You're supposed to give those to people in person, but
Yeah, timing. I did mail one to someone who asked for one from Germany, but that's the only one that's gone so far. So actually, I guess 41 copies. I was going to build like a little fort of them and hide out from the virus, but I was informed that that was not scientifically sound.
Sorry, my dog was driving me crazy. He was like, I want to come inside and I will
If you
make
got any
strange sounds
questions.
until you let me in. Okay, cool. So that's really interesting. All right. So do other people here have questions that they would like to ask about the book before we segue into some other wrinkles of writing and life?
Ooh, wrinkles. Yeah, I
Well,
like questions. Ask questions.
I haven't read the book yet, but now I wanna. And but I have read like everything H.P. Lovecraft published. So I have and I've been thinking about it lately because I had a friend ask for recommendations for like what to read if I only read a few things. So I just did that and was and have been discussing Lovecraft with this friend as he's been reading it all for the first time. So what kind of drew you to it was, like the mysterious draw of Innsmouth or the color out of space, drawing you kind of mysteriously, or did you want to be in dialogue with it? Because I one of my published stories is actually set in at Miskatonic University, and is in a mythos anthology, and so I've had to sort of engage with the issues of Lovecraft, and also my love of like the creepy crawly things and in that.
Yeah, that's a good question, because yeah, at first, when I first discovered his stuff, and also all the writers kind of around him, you know, the ones he had worked with or mentored, and the ones who inspired him.
Sure.
At first, it was just monsters and ancient libraries and crypts and labyrinths and mysterious old books, and all those, of course, are in my book, so they are very much in dialogue. But a lot of that didn't really come into play until the polish back in like 2016, when I was thinking a bit more critically about the source texts and thinking, what are some ways, not just that I could use X, Y, or Z, but what are some ways I could riff off X, Y, or Z? And the draw, I guess, at least when I first started reading it, was kind of the very, I don't know, I don't want to use the word problematic, but to me, troublesome. The troublesome contrast between some of his particularly early stuff, like the adolescent stuff and the early poems and stuff, which are they're sort of almost sad, like they're yearning. I hate my life and I wish I was somewhere else. I wish I could go on a dream quest to Kadath, and I wish I could be a hero and sail on the white ship and climb the beautiful mountains and walk through the gardens. And then you have to contrast that with this absolutely god-awful, horrific hatred and bigotry in some of these stories, where he hates people that, frankly, look like him. He doesn't even like white people. He hates everybody. Like, even in stories where you're not expecting it. Like, the one I was thinking of from the other day, I re-glanced at something. I think it was called like The Silver Key or something like that. And in a story where nothing had to do with anything, the narrator decides to find a guide and goes up to the mountain, and he mentions that the guide is a boy of pure Roman parents. And I almost threw the book across the room. I was like, what is your obsession with purity and miscegenation? What is your problem? And of course, from his letters, we know all his problems. There were many. And the fact that he let those into his fiction and even glorified them in his fiction and made a point of having plot points about his bigotry in his fiction, to me, that's not just unforgivable, it's bad writing. Why not just stick with the Kadath stuff? Why not just write stories about things that are interesting and beautiful? Why not make your horror about the monsters instead of, say, brown people or Italians? I don't know. Like, what's wrong with Italians?
You know, I read an essay that really convincingly argued that racism was the engine that drove his fiction. Like,
I think it might have been.
The Shoggoths and things were a metaphorical representation of the unwashed masses, you know, that so terrified him. So it's very hard to pull the two apart, right? I mean, there's a wonderful, there's Lovecraft story, Country by Mac Ruff, and there's a wonderful short story by Elizabeth Bear called Shoggoths and Bloom. Which
I actually,
yeah.
We did I was on the academic track last year at Worldcon, and we studied that story in one of the presentations. Probably out of the 35 or so of my short stories that are published or coming out, maybe a third of them are cosmic horror. So either Lovecraft directly or riffing off it.
Sure.
There's kind of I've written a bunch in kind of a shared universe where there aren't elder gods, but there are gods, and they hang around and occasionally do terrible things. But it's important to have hobbies. But
yes.
But yeah, the fact that you can't pull them apart means that people do come to me and they go, my God, how can you write Lovecraftian fiction? And I go, A, don't call it that. We're trying to get away from that term. Call it cosmic horror if you have to call it anything.
Yeah.
Sure.
But B, don't you think that it's legit for authors of color and women to go play in the sandbox and take out what we like? He really wasted a lot of the potential of some of those stories, I feel. And I think the mythos has a ton of potential. And I think there are ways to write it and use it as feedstock without including what drove him. And I completely agree about the Shoggoths, the more that I think about it too, because, right, they're like gigantic, and they're invisible and they're invading. And you know what drives me nuts about this? He was an American. He wasn't even English or something. He didn't have the excuse of not knowing that they came to the new continent and smashed flat and trampled and sickened and murdered and enslaved everybody that they saw, because that was how it works. I mean, I think I've said this before, but to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, white people were cosmic horror. They showed up, they ruined everything, they couldn't be understood, they just seemed to hate and hate and hate and hate. And that was what they had come for, and all you could do was try to stay ahead of them if you could. You could barely even negotiate with them. They'd be giving you smallpox blankets. Like,
Yeah.
and it bothers me that he was American and knew this and was mad that people were still coming to the country as immigrants and refugees. Like, what do you think you are, dipshit? But anyways, we may have to beat that out.
No.
Don't
I have
hold
feelings
back.
about
Tell us how
Americans
you
being
really
mad
feel.
about immigrants.
Yeah, no, I think so. But you know, it strikes me that this is I thought I had a really smart thought, but no.
Well, I could jump in. I have
Yeah.
a response, which is there's a reason he spelled everything with British spelling, right?
Ah,
And emphasized New England, because he really, I mean, he read Dunsany, right? But
Oh, yeah.
but beyond that, he really identified with the English,
yeah.
the English aristocracy, and he, I mean, that was where his emotional heart lay. It was very classist and very, Anglophilic, and everything. There was England, and then there was the uncivilized barbarians that we either have to tolerate or exterminate or enslave, or
But I think honestly,
you
this
know.
is one of the reasons why this lends itself so well to being just flipped on its ear,
Mhm.
right? Because to a great extent, he was what he was afraid of.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
It's like,
And
why?
so there's so much potential for cosmic horror to be reclaimed, subverted in its problematic expectations, turned around, etc. So, it's really exciting to see what's happening with it, with the Lovecraft Country show and like everything else.
Mhm.
And all this cosmic horror,
Yeah.
Yeah.
coming out now.
Yeah. Well, the first short story I had published when I started writing short stories again was because a friend had pinged me and said, hey, there's this anthology call and they pay cash money dollars, and maybe you could send in a story because I know that this is your thing. And that turned out to be for She Walks in Shadows.
Oh, I love that
great.
anthology.
Okay, great. So you're familiar with the anthology, right? It was an all-women Lovecraft anthology, and my story was in there, and it was specifically about a mixed race marriage, and the couple had immigrated to the US. So it was an Englishman and a woman from, I believe it was Uganda, who got married and moved to the US. And the whole time by this point, I was just picturing Lovecraft being like,
Yeah. Just cosmic horror.
just rotating in his grave.
That's great. We could
yeah.
like power an engine that way.
Oh, exactly. It's a perpetual motion. And it was funny because when I started querying the novel, one of the first replies that I got back was from my current agent asking for the partial. And he said, I thought it was very interesting to see your name in the slush pile because I happen to have liked your story in that anthology. And I was like, uh-oh. Oh God, wait, no, he knows my name. But that worked out. That worked out. So.
Well, yeah, apparently it did. That's very cool. So,
Yeah.
So what my sense of what you're working on now is that you maybe just turned in the manuscript for book 2?
Yes, May 31st.
Wow.
Yeah,
Congrats.
like just.
Yeah.
It's funny because since then and now about another 6 deadlines for stuff have come out. You know how these things go, like you get caught up and you get about a day and you go try to do like the dishes and the laundry, and then all of a sudden your email starts pinging and you're like, were you people watching to see when I was finished the book?
No. See, they were watching to see when you were done with the dishes.
Yeah, probably. They gave me that one day. They gave me a day. It wasn't until June 2nd that all the requests and stuff started coming in. But yeah, so next steps. Yeah, that one's done. That one's waiting for edits, comments, fixes. I may also end up doing some edits to it myself because, again, it's the worst book I've ever written. And I've written a lot of books by this point, so I know bad from good. And the next book that I have coming out is from ECW Press, which will be in 2021. And so I should be getting edits back from that. And that one's not cosmic horror, thrillingly enough, but the one after that is again.
So what's the book that's coming out in from ECW?
Oh, the current working title is The Annual Migration of Clouds. I don't know if we're going to change it or not because we're meeting with the cover people on Thursday. So they're going to be doing like typesetting and stuff pretty shortly here, I think. And yeah, I'm really excited for that one. That's a story close to my heart. It felt like, and writers will know how this feels too, but it felt very urgent to get out immediately and in the form that I saw it in my head. It wasn't something that I chipped away at for a really long time. I finished it in about 6 weeks. And when I was done, I was like, oh, this feels like a relief. Like I'm glad that I wrote this. Too bad I'll never be able to sell it.
And yet.
But yeah, it felt like a very personal story. It's set in my hometown. It's actually set in the university that I graduated from twice for some reason. And in a building that I spent a lot of time in. That's where people are living after this series of climate disasters and a pandemic, which was the other reason I assumed it wouldn't sell, because it's kind of a plague book.
Yeah.
But yeah, we finished up the paperwork in February, and it's supposed to be out next spring.
Wow.
So I think it just dodged the pandemic by like a week or something, a couple of weeks.
Seriously though. Well, I mean, my book has not a pandemic, but like an epidemic in it. And everything about it got arranged like way before, and then it came out in February, and then in March,
and you're like, oh no.
And everybody's like, this was so timely, and I'm like, what?
That's not how publishing works.
As we all chorus it at once.
Yeah,
that is not how publishing works.
Going, I don't know what happened here, but like
there is a lead time.
Right.
But yeah, I'm excited for people to read that one. And as with everything I write, I usually add the caveat, it looks pretty different from other stuff that I've written. And I think that's because stuff that I've written falls into about 10 different categories. And when sometimes people will like ping me on Twitter and be like, I liked your short story. It didn't sound at all like your previous short story. I'm like, yeah, sorry, that keeps happening. And then the story after that, they're like, that didn't sound at all like your other story. Or like people who have read the little novella that I published myself in 2018 with my agent's permission. I did ask, which is kind of in this Victorian voice because it's set in like 1899. They come back to me and they're like, yeah, I read your novella, but then I read your novel and they're totally different. So I'm like, they are totally different. Thank you for supporting your local author.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're different because they have to sound different, because every story calls for a different voice. They're not all going to sound the same, because they're not all about the same thing. I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Don't look at me. I don't have any writing actual education.
Well, so if you were to say what you feel it is that you bring to the writing that is unique to your history as a person, is there anything that's like your favorite topic or your favorite thing to sort of play with, etc.?
These are hard questions. I would say first, a whole lot of punctuation, and secondly, the absolute and total disregard of reality when I'm writing sci-fi. I just, after Beneath the Rising came out, one of the people who blurbed it messaged me on Twitter and was like, so I'm not a scientist, but I write sci-fi. I write hard sci-fi, lots of it. I do a lot of research. the reactor that is created in the first chapter or so of the book, it sounds kind of worryingly plausible. Could that actually work? And I wrote back, no, it cannot work. And please do not try it. I don't know if you'll end the world or not, but don't. No,
Don't try this at home.
Entirely out of my lower intestine. It doesn't exist. I made it all up. Like, I'm just a very convincing liar because that's what 2 science degrees gives you, is the ability to lie about science.
So what did you get your degrees in then?
First one was molecular genetics, and second one is referred to as land reclamation, but most people just call it soil science because it's 90% soil science courses.
Cool.
Yeah.
So that allows you to create horrible genetic mutations coming from underground in your fiction.
Like I said, it's important for people to have hobbies. And that's just why I've made very, very sure that my camera does not point anywhere near my spare room.
Are you
That's a
keeping
smile.
dirt? Where we
Okay.
can't see it.
Now I really want to see your spare room.
No, you don't. I mean, nothing. And the bioethics committee doesn't want to see it
don't want
either.
to see her spare room.
I do have to ask, Premee, is that a gorilla pod behind you on your left?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like these.
Yay, gorilla pod. Yes, I have one of those.
Yeah,
I didn't recognize that.
Yeah, it's so useful. I usually don't use my phone for Zoom and stuff anymore because I was trying it and my Wi-Fi and my phone just don't get along apparently. So it kept cutting out, so I just gave up, but I still need it there for stuff.
Cool. All right. So now I want to hear about molecular genetics.
Oh, back in the day. Yeah.
Well, I mean, let's ask this instead. To be fair. What do you feel that you bring forward from your studies into your writing?
Not a lot of the actual science, because by this point, it's all horrifically out of date. I graduated from that first degree in 2002, like I said. So the techniques have all been making logarithmic leaps since then, and I still have to read up about it if I want to use stuff in a story or make stuff up in a story. But what I think it does is give you a slightly different, not just set of skills and abilities, but outlook towards research.
Yes. Okay.
So not just where to find stuff and where to find esoteric stuff and how to organize it and how to keep it together, but how to find connections between it when they don't seem to exist. And I find that so not just useful, but fun for fiction, is smushing together several types of science that don't go together. And that's what kind of all those years and years of research teaches you, as well as, I think, the just absolute drudgery of basic research. So after I graduated from that first degree, I was on a contract for a what was their official name? Anyways, it was basically a combined oncology immunology lab. So, and it was by a team of researchers that were sharing their funding. So the mornings was hepatitis and afternoons was cancer.
Wow. Okay.
So like in the afternoon, you'd be sitting
Sounds
there.
like a blast.
Oh God. So you'd be sitting there in the afternoon, you're already tired from the morning, and you're like, I'm a scientist, I'm doing science. And science is you're looking into the counting scope and you've got one of those clickers in your hand and you're going clicky, 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 doing cell counts for like 5 hours.
Wow.
And you're thinking, for this, I needed an advanced degree.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, when the time came to renew my contract, I was like, you know, I thought I had the kind of personality that could spend the rest of my life in a lab. It turns out I don't. So that's a useful learning. And anyways, bye. And I had a lot more fun in my environmental science degree because that was more field work and very minimal lab work.
Yeah. Well, I kind of at a certain point steered away from the idea of being in a lab too. But
there are people that are just perfectly happy in labs. I graduated with a lot of friends that went on to get their master's and their PhD and their postdocs, and they just live in the lab. But I didn't realize at the time that that's not everybody.
Yeah, I have an undergrad in biology, and I've learned in getting that I'm not a scientist. I love science. I love the process of science and learning about science, but being a scientist, yeah, not to be for me.
Yeah, it's not for everyone. Yeah,
Well,
and
and I
now
think-
I'm in policy, so environmental policy.
Oh,
That's my
cool.
day job.
Well, I mean, I think there is to some degree, there is a language that you learn in that context too,
Mhm.
that I can feel you bringing to your writing. Like when you're like, what you were saying is you're really good at lying and making stuff up about science, but you know, like the kinds of language that people would use to talk about it, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to put it is after you've done enough science, what you have is the confidence to say something and not really have like plausible deniability. People are like, that sounds right, and it feels right.
Mhm.
So maybe it's legit. Like I know in a lot of my stories, I like to use science or scientists as part of the plot. The one I'm thinking of actually right now is The Redoubtables, which was in Apparition Lit in January or something around there, January, February, something like that.
Mhm.
And the premise is this journalist goes to interview someone who caused a horrific incident that more or less can't be explained to this day. And he's a scientist. And some of the things that he says, I think directly, were quotes from what I heard people saying around the lab, or in classes or by professors. And I had a lot of professors who were very much, the end justifies the means in science. The end always justifies the means. It may be a while before you see the end, but in the meantime, you have to keep the means going, even if the end is not your lifetime, even if it's not your research or the research after that or the research after that. When I was working for Agriculture Agri-Food Canada making Franken canola, everyone's favorite canola, the project that I was working on had been running for 11 years without any major success at all, but it kept getting funded year after year because eventually the canola that we had planned was going to be so good. And I also, like everybody else, went in there with the idea that this was going to be the year. I was going to be the one to come up with these successful tissue cultures and get them to actually grow and live and get them into the greenhouse and get some seeds. And that didn't happen because it hadn't happened for the previous 11 years. It didn't happen in the 12th year. To this day, I don't think it's happened.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. It is an interesting thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but when you're conveying, your made up characters, having that science background is just as useful as, say, an army vet writing military science fiction.
I think so.
You have that life experience of being in the environment, gives you a verisimilitude.
Yeah, and like you said, the environment, like you soak it up. Even if these aren't direct quotes or things that people have actually said, you're still hearing it, you're still soaking it up, and you're soaking up the attitude also. So in The Redoubtables, the old man there, the things that he's saying and the way he's trying to defend what happened, we heard that attitude all the time, even if we didn't hear those actual words.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a degree to which one could talk about it being a particular type of discourse with a capital D. Where
Discourse.
well, I mean, discourse is what I geek out about, and it basically has a lot to do with language communities and the kinds of language use that is considered to be legitimate and that confers legitimacy on its users within that context. So that seems very relevant to me to the question of how your experience in science would be translated into writing very plausible scientific scenarios, even if the science behind it was not,
Real.
the kind that you would find in an actual lab, right?
Well, and actually, I was joking about this the other day too. So one of my publishing siblings is a literal quantum physicist, and she pinged me the other day and was like, "Hey, do you want to have a Zoom call? I just, I want to chat." And I was like, "Oh my God, she read the book and is going to yell at me about the physics." That was not it at all, but I was panicking. And at the end, I did bring it up and I was like, "That's what I was worried about." And she was like, "Oh, for God's sake, don't worry about it. It's great. You're a very good liar." And I fell for most of it. I was like,
Well, there's a distinction to be made between factual and truthful.
mm-hmm.
And you want truth, and being able to talk as though it's fact conveys the truth that you need your story to
Well, and I
people
think
feel.
also there's a question of focus, right?
Mm-hmm.
The focus
I
is
also-
not on how to build the engine.
Yeah. And that's
about, okay, the engine exists. What are the consequences?
What are the consequences? And that's exactly what I was about to say, is the other crucial thing I think I've found in writing sci-fi that is outside of my specific areas of expertise, aside from the fact that the other thing that I guess I didn't mention science degrees are good for is being able to jump into another field of science and get yourself up to speed on it in a couple of weeks, which is handy. But exactly what you were saying is, if you don't focus on the science, and if you just speak confidently enough in the book and just move on from it, then you start to focus on the narrative, not on the science. And I find where I'm tempted in a short story or a novel to over-explain the science and to waffle around and provide rationalizations and reasons and facts and figures. Nope, skip it all. Confidence takes you through, and it takes you through in every genre, but it's especially useful in sci-fi.
Yeah.
Which is why my next book is fantasy.
Excellent.
I did have a question, Premee, about the choices of the inventions that Johnny makes. That that kind of get sprinkled in that she's done this and she's done that. How did you choose those? And are there going to be more in the 19 months between book one and book two?
Yes, there are going to be more. In fact, there is one. And the reason I joked about the Pope is that, spoiler alert, she literally, as a subplot, or no, as a one-off anecdote, she does get in trouble with the Vatican. Literally, they issue a papal bull against her and her companies.
Oh my God.
And her entire reaction, of course, is
yeah.
Because that's how she rolls. But yeah, that's very much the way I world build. Is I write the story, and where I find that there is a space or a spot for something either fun or interesting or actually funny, like Chembot, or that can set up something later that might be fun or interesting, I'll just throw it in there and make a note of it. So I don't come up with the world first. I make up the world as I go along, and I make sure I take notes. But yeah, all of her inventions were just things that I thought would be interesting at the time and would be interesting for her self-stated focus of saving the world. So yeah, and of course in the second book, where she has not really let go of the idea, there are a bunch more inventions, and she also makes a giant speech sort of about the focus of the new inventions and creations, and the focus of where she's directing some of the money and funding in her companies to after what happened in the first book.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I really like how that kind of ticking clock you have for her and her gifts. It really focuses her on having to not dawdle, because
yeah, she's going flat out as fast as she can, and yeah, that also is a plot point.
Interesting. Okay, well, look at that. It became 5 p.m.
Hey, this was super fun. Thank you for asking
Well,
me to come
thank
to
you
this.
so much for coming. I really enjoyed talking with you. This has been super interesting, and I hope that everybody will now run out and read your book. Yay!
Please run out and read my book. It came out during a
I will
pandemic.
run
It's
out
having
and read
problems.
her book.
Thank you.
But so
No,
what
I-
I'll do
I'm looking for-
is I am going to say that I am not sure where basically Dive into World Building is currently in a little bit of a bumpy spot because I'm in a little bit of a bumpy spot, but I am absolutely committed to continuing to do monthly author interviews, and our topic discussions will hopefully resume shortly when I feel a little bit more even keel. But honestly, the thing that I think the show does that is the most important is allow authors to speak about their ideas and their work. And in that vein, I'm super grateful to Premee Mohamed for coming on the show. And what we will do as of now is we will stop the live stream and have a little post discussion. So thank you again for coming, Premee. It was a
Thank you for
pleasure.
inviting me. I had so much fun. Thanks everyone for your questions.